The red alert klaxon blared for the third time that day. Commander Jack Nelson gripped the railing of the U.S. Valiant's bridge as the massive ship shuddered. Outside, the stars were barely visible through the swarm of enemy vessels. Their sharp, angular shapes looked like dark knives against the backdrop of space. "Status report," Jack called out, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. Lieutenant Samantha Wright's fingers flew across her console. The blue light from the screen reflected on her face as she looked up. 12 more Kragath warships just jumped into the system, sir. They're forming attack positions around Sunspire Station. Jack moved to the main view screen. Sunspire was beautiful even now. A massive space station shaped like a gleaming silver spire, home to 30,000 civilians and the last major human outpost in this sector. If it fell, there would be nothing between the Kragath and Earth's outer colonies. "Show me the enemy flagship," Jack ordered. The screen changed to display a massive black ship that seemed to absorb the light around it. Its hull was covered with strange symbols that glowed an eerie purple. "We identified it, sir," Samantha said, her voice dropping lower. "It's the Void Talon, Supreme War Leader Drexon's personal warship." A heavy silence fell over the bridge. Everyone knew what that meant. 3 months ago, Drexon had led the attack on Outpost Zeta. No one had survived. Jack ran a hand through his short brown hair. "They're not just sending raiders this time. They want to end this war here and now." On the other side of the bridge, Communications Officer Ben Garcia removed his headset. "Sir, Admiral Carter is calling an emergency meeting for all command staff. 10 minutes in the Sunspire war room. Tell him I'll be there." Jack turned to his second-in-command. "Greg, you have the bridge." Lieutenant Commander Greg Powell nodded. "Yes, sir." As Jack headed for the door, he stopped by Samantha Station. "Sam, make sure our new shield modifications are online. Dr. Rivera has been working day and night on them." "Already done, sir," Samantha replied, bringing up a diagnostic screen. "But the power requirements are massive. Chief Miller says we can only run them for 20 minutes before we risk overloading the core." 20 minutes might be all we get," Jack said quietly. He stepped into the corridor, where crew members rushed back and forth preparing for battle. Their faces showed fear, but also determination. These people, his people, were ready to fight, even knowing the odds. The journey to Sunspire took only minutes by shuttle. As Jack docked at the station, he could see the defensive fleet taking positions. 47 ships against the Kragath armada of over 200. The math wasn't in their favor. Inside the station, people moved with urgent purpose. Some were soldiers, others were civilians preparing to evacuate. A small boy clutching a stuffed toy rocket watched Jack walk by in his commander's uniform. The child gave him a solemn salute. Jack returned it, feeling the weight of that small gesture on his shoulders. The war room doors slid open. Inside, officers from every ship in the fleet gathered around a large holographic display showing the approaching enemy forces. Admiral William Carter, a tall man with dark skin and graying hair, stood at the head of the table. "Commander Nelson," the admiral acknowledged. "Glad you could join us. We're about to begin the briefing that might determine the fate of humanity." Jack took his seat. The room darkened as the holographic display grew brighter, illuminating their faces with the cold light of approaching doom. The battle for Sunspire was about to begin. The war room fell silent as Admiral Carter tapped his screen. The hologram in the center of the table changed, showing the massive Kragath fleet approaching Sunspire. In the blue light, the faces of the officers looked grim. "I won't lie to you," Admiral Carter said. "We are outnumbered 4-1. Their weapons are stronger than ours. Their shields have stopped everything we've thrown at them for the past year. By normal military thinking, this battle is already lost." A murmur ran through the room. Jack felt his stomach tighten. He had lost too many friends in this war to accept defeat now. The Admiral's face softened slightly. "But we may have found a way to change the rules." The doors slid open. Dr. Elena Rivera walked in, carrying a small metal case. Her lab coat was wrinkled, and dark circles showed under her eyes. Jack knew she had been working nonstop for weeks. "Dr. Rivera, please share your findings," Admiral Carter said, gesturing to the front of the room. Elena placed the case on the table and opened it. Inside was a device about the size of a football, glowing with a faint blue light. "3 months ago, we recovered this piece of Kragath technology from the Battle of Proxima Centauri," she said. Her voice was tired but clear. "We've been studying it day and night." She pressed a button on her tablet. The hologram changed to show a complex diagram of swirling energy fields. "The Kragath ships use what we call a quantum resonance field," Elena continued, pointing to the display. "It's why our weapons bounce off their hulls. The field absorbs and redirects energy. It's like trying to punch through water." Captain Daniel Green of the U.S. Intrepid leaned forward. His face was scared from a previous battle. "We already know their shields are tough, Doctor. Is there a point to this science lesson?" Elena didn't flinch. She tapped her tablet again. The hologram changed to show the small device from her case. "This is a quantum disruptor," she said. "It sends out a special frequency that interferes with their shield technology, like singing the right note to shatter a glass." The room grew perfectly still. Jack could almost feel the hope building around him. Admiral Carter broke the silence. "Dr. Rivera and her team have created something that could change the course of this war. If it works, the Kragath ships will be vulnerable to our weapons." "What do you mean, if it works?" asked Commander Lisa Ward from the U.S. Defiant. "Haven't you tested it?" Elena shook her head. "We've run simulations. They look promising. But we can't create a full Kragath shield system to test against. We need to try it in battle." "There's more," Admiral Carter added, his voice heavy. "The disruptor has a limited range. It needs to be delivered deep into the enemy fleet, close to their command ship, then activated." Jack saw the implication immediately. So did everyone else in the room. Someone would need to fly straight into the heart of the enemy fleet. Captain Green gave a short, bitter laugh. "So we need a volunteer for a suicide mission." "I wouldn't call it suicide," Elena said quietly. "Difficult, yes. Dangerous, absolutely. But not impossible." Jack studied the hologram showing the enemy formation. His mind was already calculating approach vectors, blind spots in the Kragath sensor grid. "What's the effective range?" he asked. Elena looked at him. 5 kilometers from their command ship. Their eyes met across the table. In that moment, Jack made his decision. Jack stood up from his chair. The hologram's light made his face look older as he looked around at the assembled officers. "The Valiant has the best stealth technology in the fleet," he said, his voice cutting through the heavy silence. "We can get close enough. My ship will deliver the disruptor." Admiral Carter's eyes narrowed. "You understand what you're volunteering for, Commander. The math doesn't look good." "With respect, Admiral, I don't care about the math," Jack replied. "What I care about is ending this war before we lose another outpost. Another 30,000 lives." Captain Green slammed his hand on the table. "This is crazy, Nelson. You're talking about flying straight into 200 enemy ships. Would you prefer to sit here and wait for them to kill us all?" Jack shot back. Admiral Carter raised his hand for silence. "Commander Nelson is right. We need to take this chance. The Valiant's stealth systems give us our best shot." He looked at Jack with concern in his eyes. "You'll need 12 hours to prepare, and I can't order your crew to go with you." "I wouldn't want you to, sir," Jack said. "This will be volunteers only." The meeting broke up soon after. Officers hurried back to their ships to prepare for the coming battle. Jack walked quickly down the corridor toward the shuttle bay. He needed to get back to the Valiant. "Commander, wait up." Lieutenant Peter Johnson, Jack's navigation officer, jogged to catch up with him. Pete was young, barely 25, with a friendly face and quick smile that hid his brilliant mind. I'm guessing from your expression that we're doing something either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid, Pete asked, falling into step beside Jack. Both, Jack replied with a grim smile. We're taking the Valiant into the heart of the Kragath fleet. Pete whistled low. That's quite a plan. It's a volunteer mission, Pete. I need you to understand that, Jack said seriously. No one gets ordered in on this one. When do we leave? Pete asked without hesitation. Jack stopped walking and turned to face his young officer. You don't need to decide now. Think about it. Talk to your family. Pete shook his head. My family is on Earth, Commander. If we don't stop the Kragath here, they'll be next. I'm in. Back on the Valiant, Jack called a ship-wide meeting in the main hangar bay. All 200 crew members gathered there, standing in neat rows. Jack took a deep breath before speaking. In 12 hours, we will take this ship into the middle of the Kragath fleet, he said, his voice echoing in the large space. Our mission is to deliver a device that might change the course of this war. I won't lie to you. The chances of coming back are slim. The crew was silent, watching him intently. This mission is strictly volunteer, Jack continued. Anyone who wishes to stay behind will be transferred to Sunspire Station with no mark on their record. No questions asked. No judgment. Chief Engineer Frank Miller, a burly man with 20 years of service, stepped forward. How long do we have to decide, sir? 4 hours, Jack replied. After that, we begin final preparations. Jack walked off the platform, leaving his crew to make their choice. He had work to do, preparations to make. The weight of his decision pressed down on him with every step. 4 hours later, Jack stood in his ready room looking at the final crew manifest. He read it again, thinking there must be some mistake. Not a single crew member had requested transfer. Every last person on the Valiant had volunteered to go. The observation deck on Sunspire Station was almost empty. Most people were either preparing for battle or had already evacuated to the inner chambers. Large windows curved from floor to ceiling, offering a breathtaking view of space. Stars shone like diamonds against the black backdrop. In the distance, the human fleet formed a protective wall around the station, their running lights blinking in the darkness. Jack stood alone by the window, hands clasped behind his back. In 8 hours, the Valiant would depart on its mission. He had checked and double-checked every detail of their plan. Now all he could do was wait. The soft hiss of the door opening broke the silence. Jack didn't need to turn around to know who it was. The faint scent of vanilla and coffee gave her away. I had a feeling I'd find you here, Dr. Elena Rivera said, coming to stand beside him. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she'd traded her lab coat for standard-issue navy pants and a gray t-shirt. Just taking one last look, Jack replied. It's quite a view. Elena nodded, her eyes moving over the vista of ships and stars. The disruptor is ready. My team just finished the final calibrations. Good, Jack said. Your people have performed miracles in an impossible time frame. They stood in silence for a moment, watching as a small transport ship docked with the station. I saw your mission plan, Elena said finally. The part where you'll need to drop out of stealth to activate the disruptor. Jack kept his eyes on the stars. There was no way around it. The energy signature would give us away anyway. I know. She turned to face him. I also know the Valiant's engines won't have enough power to escape the blast radius once you activate it. Jack finally looked at her. In the dim light of the observation deck, her face was half in shadow. We'll find a way. Elena's expression softened. This wasn't how I imagined we'd finally have that dinner you've been promising me for the past year. Despite everything, Jack smiled. Rain check for when I get back. I'll hold you to that, Commander, she replied. There was a slight tremor in her voice that she couldn't quite hide. Elena reached into her pocket and pulled out a small metal disc. This is a modified personal shield generator. It's not much, but it might buy you a few extra seconds if things get rough. Jack took it, their fingers brushing. Thank you. There's something else you should know, Elena said, her tone becoming more professional. "The disruptor's range is shorter than we hoped. You'll need to get within 5 kilometers of their command ship." Jack nodded, slipping the shield generator into his pocket. "We'll get it done." "I know you will," Elena said softly. The station's PA system crackled to life. "All senior officers report to Admiral Carter for final briefing." "Repeat, all senior officers report for final briefing." Jack straightened his uniform. "Duty calls." "Jack," Elena said as he turned to leave. "The calculations I showed everyone earlier, they weren't the full story." He paused. "What do you mean?" "I told them the chance of survival was low," she said, her eyes meeting his. "What I didn't say was that according to every simulation we ran, it's 0. No matter what variables we changed, the result was always the same." Jack was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached out and gently squeezed her hand. "Some things can't be calculated, Elena. Humanity doesn't end at Sunspire. Not on my watch." He let go of her hand and walked toward the door. As it slid open, he looked back one last time. Elena stood framed against the stars, watching him go. In the corridor, Jack took a deep breath. 8 hours until the Valiant departed. 8 hours until they changed the course of the war, or die trying. The U.S. Valiant drifted through the darkness of space like a ghost. Its stealth systems hummed softly, bending light around the hull and masking its heat signature. To the Kragath sensors, this section of space appeared empty. On the bridge, the crew worked in near silence. The usual chatter was absent. Everyone understood what was at stake. Jack sat in the command chair, watching the main view screen. Ahead of them, the massive Kragath fleet spread out in a complex formation. Their ships were black and angular, covered with glowing purple symbols. The largest, the Void Talon, sat at the center like a spider in its web. "Distance to target?" Jack asked quietly. Lieutenant Samantha Wright checked her readings. 15 kilometers and closing, sir. Their outer patrol ships are just ahead." Jack nodded. "Pete, status of our approach vector." Lieutenant Peter Johnson's hands moved smoothly over the navigation controls. The holographic display before him showed their planned path through the enemy fleet. "Threading the needle now, Commander," Pete replied. His usual jokes were gone, replaced by intense focus. "If their patrol ships maintain current speed and heading, we should pass between them undetected." Jack felt sweat forming on his forehead, despite the cool air of the bridge. The Valiant was deep in enemy territory now. If they were spotted, there would be no rescue, no backup. 10 kilometers, Samantha announced. The tension in her voice was clear. On the screen, 2 Kragath patrol ships drifted past, so close that Jack could see the details of their weapon arrays. For a heart-stopping moment, one of the ships seemed to turn toward them, but then it continued on its path. The comm system crackled. "Bridge, this is engineering." Chief Frank Miller's gruff voice filled the room. "Commander, we have a problem. The stealth system is starting to fluctuate. The power draw from the disruptor is causing interference." Jack pressed a button on his chair arm. "How bad is it, Frank?" "Bad enough," Frank replied. "The disruptor needs more power than we expected. I can reroute from secondary systems, but that's just a bandage on a bullet wound." "How long can you keep us hidden?" Jack asked. There was a pause. 3 minutes, maybe 4. After that, we're as visible as a supernova. Jack looked around at his bridge crew. They all knew what that meant. Their plan had been to slip in, deploy the disruptor, and try to slip out before the chaos started. That plan was now falling apart. 7 kilometers to target, Samantha reported. Her screen was blinking with warning indicators. A low rumble vibrated through the ship. On the view screen, one of the nearby Kragath vessels was turning, its sensors sweeping the area. "They're picking up something," Samantha said urgently. "Not a clear reading yet, but they know something's not right." Jack made his decision. "All hands, prepare for emergency maneuvers." His voice was calm but firm. "Pete, plot a direct course to the Void Talon. No more sneaking. Give me maximum speed." He hit the comm button again. "Frank, forget the stealth systems. Divert all power to engines and the disruptor. We're making our run now." "Aye, Commander," Frank replied. "The stealth field will collapse completely." "That's the idea," Jack said grimly. "If we can't hide, we'll run." The Valiant's engines roared to life. The ship surged forward, its stealth field dissolving into sparks of energy as it accelerated toward the heart of the enemy fleet. Behind them, alarm signals blared across the Kragath ships as they finally spotted the lone human vessel charging straight at them. Red lights flashed across the Valiant's bridge as alarms screamed their warnings. The ship shook violently as the first Kragath energy beam struck the port side. "Multiple weapons locks," Samantha shouted over the noise. Her screen lit up with dozens of incoming attack vectors. "They're firing from all directions." Jack gripped his command chair as the ship lurched. Evasive maneuvers, pattern Delta 6. Pete's hands flew across his console. The Valiant rolled sharply to the right, narrowly avoiding a beam that would have cut through their engines. "Status of the disruptor," Jack called into the comm. The reply was barely audible over the sounds of systems overloading in engineering. 90 seconds to full charge," Frank reported. "But Commander, we've got problems down here. The power couplings are starting to fail." Another hit rocked the ship. Sparks cascaded from damaged consoles across the bridge. Lieutenant Kelly Martinez, the tactical officer, was thrown from her station. Blood streaming from a cut on her forehead, she dragged herself back to her post. "Shields at 40%, Kelly called out, wiping blood from her eyes. "We can't take much more of this." "Distance to target," Jack demanded. 3 kilometers, Pete answered, his young face streaked with sweat. "We're almost there, sir." A massive blast struck the Valiant, much stronger than the others. Warning sirens took on a new, more urgent tone. "Hull breach on deck 4, Samantha reported, her voice tight with fear. "Automatic containment failing." Jack hit the comm button. "Damage control teams to deck 4. Frank, status of the disruptor." 60 seconds, Commander," Frank replied. The sound of escaping air could be heard behind his voice. "But we've lost pressure in sections 12 through 15, and the power core is reaching critical levels." Jack closed his eyes for a brief moment. The calculations had been right. They wouldn't survive long enough to deploy the disruptor and escape, but they could still complete the mission. He opened the ship-wide channel. "All hands, this is the commander." He kept his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "Prepare for ramming speed." Pete turned in his chair, eyes wide. "Sir." "You heard me, Lieutenant," Jack said. "Set course directly for the Void Talon's command center. Maximum speed." Jack looked around at his bridge crew. In their eyes, he saw understanding dawn. And behind the fear, something else. Determination. They had all volunteered for this mission, knowing the risks. Now, facing the final moment, not one of them faltered. "It's been an honor serving with all of you," Jack said simply. Then he turned to Pete. "Take us in." The Valiant's engines pushed beyond their safety limits as the ship accelerated toward the massive Kragath flagship. The disruptor's energy readings climbed higher, approaching critical levels. On the view screen, the Void Talon grew larger. Its weapons batteries turned toward the approaching human vessel, unleashing a barrage that battered the Valiant's failing shields. Jack thought of Elena watching from Sunspire station, of the colonies that would fall if they failed here, of Earth itself, the home he had sworn to protect. Another direct hit caused part of the ceiling to collapse. Smoke filled the bridge, but Pete remained at his post, guiding their final approach. "Disruptor at 90%. Frank's voice called over the comm. "Impact in 10 seconds. The Kragath flagship filled the entire view screen now. Jack could see individual weapon ports, alien script carved into the hull, and the central command structure, their target. 5 seconds. Jack gripped his chair and whispered, for humanity. The Valiant slammed into the Void Talon at full speed, the disruptor releasing all its energy at the moment of impact. A brilliant flash of light erupted in the darkness of space. From the command deck of Sunspire Station, Admiral Carter watched as the Valiant collided with the massive Kragath flagship. For several heartbeats, nothing happened. The enemy fleet continued to advance. Faces around him fell, thinking the sacrifice had been in vain. Then, something changed. The Void Talon's purple energy shields flickered once, twice, and disappeared. A ripple of energy spread outward from the point of impact, washing over the nearby Kragath ships. One by one, their shields began to fail. "It worked," Admiral Carter whispered. Then louder, "It worked." He grabbed the fleet-wide communication system. "All ships, this is Admiral Carter. The Valiant has succeeded. The disruptor is working. The enemy shields are down. Commence attack pattern Omega. Today, we take the fight back to the enemy." The human fleet surged forward. For the first time in the war, their weapons found their targets. Laser cannons cut through the previously impenetrable Kragath hulls. Missiles struck home, causing explosions across the enemy formation. What had seemed like certain defeat transformed into something else, a chance to fight back. On Sunspire's command deck, Dr. Elena Rivera stood silently watching the battle unfold on the main view screen. Her face was pale, eyes red-rimmed. A single tear tracked down her cheek, catching the light from the tactical displays. "They did it," she said softly. "Jack did it." Lieutenant Commander Susan Miller, Jack's second-in-command who had been ordered to remain on Sunspire to coordinate communications, placed a hand on Elena's shoulder. "He always said the needs of humanity outweighed the needs of any single ship or crew." Elena wiped her eyes and straightened her shoulders. She pointed to a data stream coming in from the sensors. "Look at this. The quantum disruption is spreading through their entire fleet. It's affecting their weapon systems too, not just their shields." Susan stepped closer to the screen. "This technology could change everything. We could push them back." "Not just push them back," Elena said, her voice finding new strength. "We could end this war." Across the command deck, officers who had been bracing for death now worked with renewed energy. Reports came in from the fleet, Kragath ships retreating, others disabled by the cascading failure of their systems. Admiral Carter approached Elena and Susan. His weathered face showed a mix of triumph and sorrow. "Dr. Rivera, your team's work just saved Sunspire, and possibly all of humanity. Commander Nelson and the Valiant crew did not die in vain." Elena nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Then she gestured to her datapad. "I need to get back to my lab." The readings we're getting. "There's so much more we can learn from this." "Go," the Admiral said. "And know that when this is over, the Valiant and her crew will be remembered as the heroes who turned the tide." As Elena hurried from the command deck, communication stations throughout the station began to light up. The news of the battle was spreading to the colonies. For the first time since the war began, people dared to hope. 3 days later, as the last Kragath ships fled the system, a recovery team found something unexpected floating among the debris of the battle. A single escape pod, its power nearly depleted, drifting silently in the void. Inside, barely alive but still breathing, was a lone human. On the pod's damaged hull, a name was still visible: U.S. Valiant. The battle for humanity's future had only just begun, but now they would face it with new hope. And perhaps with a hero who had returned from the impossible.